Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Evan and the organizers for putting together this very interesting conference and for this opportunity to speak. So I'll be talking about joint work with my PhD student I'm co-advising, George Xiao. He's actually he knows this material much better than I do. I'll do my best, but he's defending his dissertation later today, and so I think he's a little bit occupied. And what I'll talk about is so multi-level Monte Carlo for spiking neurons. I'll explain all this. I do apologize ahead of time that there's the first half of the talk is pretty introductory for those of you who know the subject, but since it's a pretty broad audience, I thought it's good to make sure we're on the same page. Okay, so so this is a talk primarily about numerical methods, and the kind of models that I have in mind are large networks of spiking neuron models. And so so as you will see, we're not quite there yet. This work is kind of at beginning stages, but so to give you a flavor of what we do, so when we simulate a large network, right, so often the kinds of abstractly the kind of questions that we're interested in is I have a network model, I present it with some stimulus, and then I like to see what happens after I present the stimulus. And so this figure, for example, is taken from one of a joint paper with some co-authors. And so in this simulation, we were interested in what happens in a network of spiking neurons if we introduce an extra spike at a certain time, and then and what happens to the dynamics subsequent to that. Okay. And I don't want to get into that story because that's a long story in and of itself. But the thing that I want to emphasize is that when we look at networks, that spiking neuron networks that we use to model different parts of the brain, we see randomness everywhere, right? So we see randomness in the stimuli. Often these stimuli are modeled as Poisson processes, or maybe some kind of color Gaussian noise process or something. There's often noise in the dynamics. The dynamics of individual neurons, for example, can be noisy, and of course, the networks also may have some structural variability. There may be plasticity, maybe the connectivity is changing in some way, and so on. Okay, and so I'm sort of belaboring the obvious here, which is that when we simulate large networks, oftentimes what we're interested in is, well, sometimes we're interested in just computing, simulating something and seeing what's going on. But we also like to be able to quantify what we see, and that means computing averages. Okay, and so most of the things that we are used to computing, so we might compute firing rates as functions of time, conditional firing rates by trigger averages. In my little example here, we were interested in computing the Lyapunov exponents, so characterizing how fast nearby trajectories separate, various types of temporal or spatial correlations that you might calculate. All these are statistical averages. Okay. And so the purpose of my talk is to, so the focus of my talk is about how to compute these statistics faster. Okay. And okay, and so let me be a little bit more precise about what I mean. So I'm going to back up a step and talk about the naive or the simple Monte Carlo method for dynamical systems. Okay, so of which neural networks are a particular example. All right, so suppose I have some dynamical system that's non-autonomous. Okay, so I have some state variables x, and it's a function of some time-dependent things. These could represent all the stimuli and all your noise sources and so on. And what I want to compute is the expectation of some observable g at some later time t. Okay, and it's a function of the state. Right. So the direct what I call the direct Monte Carlo estimator is this very simple procedure that we have all many of us have carried out, which is I simulate I carry out M simulations, and I evaluate G on the state at time t, and then I just average. Okay, and so xt, of course, the state is a function of both the initial condition and the specific realization of the forcing that I see, and upon the so in each of these terms, I would just use an independent realization. Okay, and so okay, so that's simple enough. Except the only thing is, in order to since we're interested in networks, these equations may be expensive to solve, and then on top of which, if you're going to do it lots and lots of times, then that can get expensive. Okay. And so many of you are numerical analysts, and so numerical analysts are people who get excited about errors. So I'm going to talk about errors here. And so since this is statistical, a standard way to break down the error is in terms of the variance. Well, so a standard way to measure the error, first of all, is by the mean square error. So G hat here is that direct Monte Carlo estimator I wrote down earlier. And so, so I'm interested in how far this is from the expectation I'm going to compute in a mean square sense. And this breaks down easily into a term that's the variance. And then there's a term that's the bias. Okay. And the bias here, so bias actually refers to quantity inside the parentheses. So it's the difference in expectation between the thing you can estimate and the thing that you are trying to compute. Okay. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So so the variance comes from the fact that I have finitely many samples. Okay. And it has a very simple scaling. It's just it's proportional to 1. The variance is proportional to 1 over the number of samples that you take. Okay. And the bias in this setting mainly comes from the fact that in order to solve the equations of motion for my network, I need to discretize it somehow, okay, by some kind of numerical scheme. No matter what scheme I choose, there will be some truncation errors, and so and that typically leads to some kind of a bias. Okay, and so in principle, both of these are very easy to fix. If you want lower variance, just increase the number of samples, and if you want less bias, then you just decrease the step size. But of course, both of these things mean a lot more computer time. Okay, so you like to try to avoid that. Okay. And I want to get rid of that. So so multi-level Monte Carlo is a effort to try to get around this, and it mainly is focused on time stepping. And in particular, the thing that you would like to do is to get all the benefits of taking large time steps. Okay, so that's a cheap computation, but you also want the accuracy of a small time step computation. Okay. And so how do you do that? Okay, so so multi-level Monte Carlo was originally developed in the context of stochastic differential equations for SDEs, and so I want to first review it in that context, and then explain what's different when you have neuron models, spiking neuron models. Okay, so here's a SDE with just simple additive noise. So first we need to numerically integrate it. And so with apology to the previous speakers, I agree with everything they say, but I am going to, oh, this is not, it's not moving. Sorry. I seem to be having, okay, sorry. I may have to, oops, that crashed. Okay, so where was I? Sorry about that. Okay, so there you go, SDEs. Okay, so with apologies to, it's catching up now. So with apologies to the previous speakers, I'm going to use the Euler scheme, and to Evelyn as well. I'm going to use the Euler scheme to illustrate the ideas. It's just convenient. Nothing that I'll talk about is really specifically tied to Euler. Maruyama. Okay, and so if you discretize a SDE with additive noise with the Euler scheme, this is what you get. Okay. And just reminder, most of you know this, so you can measure the accuracy of the order scheme in a couple of ways. One way is by what's called a weak error, which is just the how good are your estimates of expectations. And here I'm abusing notation a little bit. So x sub t is the true solution, but x sub n is the numerical solution. Okay, and this is you get an error that's first order in the step size. And then in the strong error or the root mean square error, you get a half order. Okay, so these are standard results. Okay. And so multi-level Monte Carlo, when you apply it to this context, means the following. So the philosophy, so multi-level Monte Carlo is a multi-grid method, okay, and is but in time, and it is you can also view it as a predictor corrector method. And the idea is you make a rough prediction using a large step size, and then you make an accurate correction. Okay, so here's the 2-level version. So what I would call the 0th level is you would do what the direct Monte Carlo that I just described, but with twice the step size that you choose. Okay, so this is a 2-level version, and then and the correction consists of the average of the difference between the estimate that you get taking smaller step sizes minus the estimate that you get from the coerced grid. Okay? And the multi-level Monte Carlo estimator is just for some choices of a number of samples at the coercer grid and the final grid. You just add those. Okay. And the notation is kind of a mess, but the goal, one thing that I want to know here is that if you take the expectations of both sides, then it's easy to see that what you get is you just get this telescoping sum. So this cancels, and then you just get this. Okay, so in other words, even though you're doing stepping both at the coercer and final grids, the bias is actually you just see the final grid. Okay, and this is really the heart of multi-grid Monte Carlo in some sense. And one of the and so the thing that would make this method work is that if you had a low variance estimator for this correction, okay, then what you can do is you can take lots of samples with a bigger time step, which is cheap, and then do fewer samples with the expensive finer on the expensive final grid. Okay, so that's basically the idea. And so the heart of it is to try to get a good low variance estimate of these corrections. Okay, so how do you do that? Okay, I actually mentioned if you have it in practice, you often want to use more than just 2 levels, and so you can so the simplest thing is to use dyadic grids. So you just multiply by 2, and then in practice, what you would do is you can try to optimize the number of samples that you take at each level, depending on the variance, to optimize the variance of the overall estimator, given the constraint on computational time. Okay, so okay, so that's so this is straightforward to generalize to more than 2 levels. Okay. So let me talk about these corrections. Okay, so the obvious thing that you don't want to do is to the thing you obviously do not want to do in this difference of terms here is to use 2 independent realizations, because you want to get you want this to have small variance, and so you want these 2 terms to be as positively correlated as possible. Okay, and so a standard way to do that is to just solve the equations at step delta t and step size delta 2 delta t with the same forcing. Okay, so here I roll it out in gory detail. The important terms are here. So I drive the final grid with some random numbers. Then I use the same random numbers on the coercer grid. Okay, and this averaging divided by √2 just make sure that the variance remains 1. Okay, okay, so when can you expect this to work well? So one way to conceptualize this is to think about this coupling construction in the limit as delta t goes to 0, in which case what you have is just two copies of the same SDE coupled by the same realization of white noise, maybe not necessarily starting from the same conditions. And one of the things that conceptually, from a dynamical point of view, you would like this coupling to do is to force these solutions starting at different initial conditions, but with the same noise to come together to converge as t goes to infinity. Okay, so these are solutions to SDEs. They'll always be evolving in time, but you want a pair of trajectories to converge, and that's the reason that I like to bring this up is because it starts to give you a hint that how well multi-level Monte Carlo is going to work. It's not completely black box. It's not a completely black box method in the sense that how well it works depends on the underlying dynamics. Okay, and this will become more important when we get to spiking networks. The other thing that I want to point out, and this we'll use again later, is that how well multi-level Monte Carlo works. Multi-level Monte Carlo works is related, well, how well this coupling correction works is related to the strong accuracy of your method, in the sense that, and I forgot a line here, but if you look at the variance of that correction that I wrote down earlier, with some, if you assume your G is sufficiently regular, you can easy to see that would have the same scaling, same dependence on the step size as the strong error. Okay, and that's because the numerical solutions they're both coupled to the true solution, and so that this is the scaling that you see. Okay, and so how good the correction you can get is related to the strong accuracy. Okay? And so and this is yeah. So let me just move on. Okay, and I like to just put this question in your mind, because we'll come back to this, which is that if you have dynamics that are sensitive to perturbations, okay, then multi-level Monte Carlo might have issues. Okay, so that's so we'll come back to that. Okay, so finally we're going to talk about spiking neurons. So my neuron models are very, very simple. I'm just going to talk about what's called a leaky integrand fire neuron. And so, so the dynamics is just it's linear dynamics. So here's a picture. And all of you know this. So so I have subspatial dynamics that's linearly dependent on the voltage. And then when I hit the threshold, I spike, and then that gets reset, and then I continue again evolving. Okay. And for networks, we're going to consider networks of this form. The main thing is that so when the neuron spikes, it generates so we have both excitatory and inhibitory neurons, and the effect of excitatory neurons is to try to push the voltage up towards the threshold, and then when the this inhibitory current term has the tendency to pull down the voltage towards resting, and the coupling constants here specify the structure of the matrix. Okay, I'm just looking at this. I typed this really late at night, so may have been some typos in the equations. But anyway, so I apologize for that, but I hope everyone gets the rough idea. Okay. So multi-level Monte Carlo. Oh, and one thing that I forgot to say. Sorry. And the important thing is that we generally do not study these networks in isolation, but there are some external stimuli, and so external stimuli here, the external stimuli here can take the form of Poisson spike train, or it can also be white noise. Okay, so whatever you choose for your input or some other kind of stochastic process, and whatever you choose for your model, generalizing multi-level Monte Carlo to leaky integrand fire networks is actually very straightforward. You just make two copies of your network. You solve them with solve these equations with different time steps, and you couple them by using the same realization of forcing. Okay, so that's the numerical method. Okay, so that's so formulating the method is very straightforward. But then now the question is, how well does it work? Okay. Now, why might you expect it to not behave exactly the same as SDEs? So one of the issues is spikes. I try to paint this picture of multi-level Monte Carlo working well when solutions of your equations of motion are pushed together in phase space, and spiking, because of the discontinuity involved in spiking, that makes that harder. Right? There are discontinuous jumps, and the trajectories have to somehow track each other across these continuous jumps. And so that's one issue. The other one is going to be eventually when we look at large networks. Okay, so spiking happens even with a single cell, but when you couple cells together into a large network, what you're going to start to, the other issue that we need to worry about is that we know networks can be very sensitive to small perturbations. In particular, in studying cortical dynamics, people often use, the network models are often tuned what's called a balance regime. And we know there's a vast literature on the unbalanced networks where the excitation and inhibition are balanced in a certain sense. And these networks can be very, very sensitive to small perturbations. Okay? And so that also raises another question about how effective these multi-level Monte Carlo would be for such networks. Okay, so I'm running a little bit behind. I've got 5 minutes. No, less than that. About 5. Okay. So I'll try to just hit the main point. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about what we did, which is we try to understand what multi-level Monte Carlo does as a single neuron level, and then so for single neurons we can do some heuristic analysis, and then for networks we don't have any analytical results, but we have some intuitive understanding, we think, and so I like to present some numerical results there. Okay, so for single neurons, here's the thing that we did. So we looked at this. This is the single leading integrifier again. I'm driving it with a constant current I and a white noise term. Okay, so not Poisson but white noise. That makes the a little bit easier to think about. Okay, and so the question for multi-level Monte Carlo now is if I solve these equations with time step delta t and delta 2 delta t, okay, how well do those two trajectories couple? Okay, and remember this is related to the strong error of whatever numerical scheme that you're using to solve the equations. Okay, and so here's a summary of the results. It turns out it depends on how you're driving the neuron. If you're in what we call a mean-driven regime, so where the current's large enough to induce persistent spiking by itself, then what happens is that the strong error is half order in the step size. Okay, and this how we conceptualize this. The scaling is this. Okay, so this is not quite how the analysis goes, but this is how I think about it, which is that the probability of two. So you can convince yourself somehow that the probability of two, if you start with the same initial condition, then the strong accuracy tells you of SDE tells you that before you hit that first spike, you stay within about delta t to the 1/2 of each other, and then one copy spikes, and then the other one hopefully shortly after also spikes, and so the probability that two spikes fall within the order delta t interval turns out to be pretty high, and something like one minus order of delta t or even larger, and so 1 minus O of delta t of the time, you're within order of delta t of each other in the mean square error sense. And then the rest of the time you're order 1 apart, but that only happens to probability order delta t. And so overall, the mean square error is order delta t. And then so the strong error should be order delta t to the 1/2. Okay, so that's a conceptual way of thinking about the scaling. In the fluctuation driven regime, where you're running on the noise to drive you over the spike threshold, things are different. It turns out that this probability is going to be much larger. Sorry, the probability of two spikes within the order delta t interval, so within the same time bin, is much smaller. And so if you work out the scaling, what you arrive at is delta t to the quarter. is what you can conclude from this. And so in the fluctuation-driven regime, even for the single neuron, things are worse. Okay, and we have numerical results, but in the interest of time, I'll move on, and I'll also skip over there. You can say something about feed-forward networks, but that's not really the most interesting thing. Okay, so recurrent networks. So as we know, there's a long literature on balanced networks, especially that recurrent network of the type that people use to model cortical dynamics and be very sensitive perturbations. And there's in particular a lot of recent work on showing that balanced networks is a whole range of different behavior in terms of different degrees of synchrony. They can range from very homogeneous, more mean field-like behavior to of course very highly synchronized states, but also all sorts of states in between, where you can have all sorts of partial synchrony. Okay, and so we tried this, and what we found out was that in the homogeneous mean field type regime, multilevel Monte Carlo works pretty well. Okay, so these are log plots showing the I don't know if you can read this, but the weak errors and the of different statistics, and they show a clear trend towards convergence. Okay, but in contrast, if I did this with one of these partial with one of the a network in a partially synchronized state, then things are then I don't get this nice scaling, and this is going to be my last slide. So we did a systematic study of this. And so one way to characterize how well, so let me explain what this plot is. So we have randomly coupled networks. We set the E to I and I to E connections to be the same, and E to E and I to I connections to be the same. And we just varied it over this parameter space. And what's being shown is oh, this is hard to read, sorry. I have two copies of the network at different time steps. And I'm looking at the difference in the relative difference in the firing rate that I compute. Okay, so this is a measure of how good the coupling is working. And what you can see is that up here, corresponding to the more synchronous spiking activity, the relative error is much larger than down here, where the coupling is much more effective. And this region down here corresponds exactly to the more homogeneous mean field behavior, and up here is the more synchronous behavior. Okay, so I think I've used up all my time and then some, so I'll stop there. There's my collaborator. We did a bit more work on weak accuracy and on what I call dynamical stability of couplings. We have a preprint that's almost done. It should be on the archive later this week, hopefully. And I give a standard reference for multi-level Monte Carlo, and I will stop there. So thank you all for your attention.
So thank you very much for your nice talk. We do have a question by Peter Kramer. Could you say a bit more about why the strong error of the trajectories is different in fluctuation versus mean-driven regime? I mean, the probability for to occur.
Yeah, so I can say something about. Yeah, so the question about why the two regimes are different. So okay, so yeah, so the issue is okay, so let me walk through this a little bit more carefully. So so first, so I got two trajectories. One of them is supposed to be time step delta t, and the other one's supposed to be 2 delta t. Okay, and they're driven by the same noise. Okay, so in case you're wondering, the reason that in this picture, in the mean-driven regime, especially, the noise actually helps you push trajectories together. Okay, so if you even if you start with the same initial condition, because the time step's different, you're going to diverge a little bit. Okay, and so the issue is that you would like, because you care about strong errors, you would like when one trajectory spikes, the other one also spikes not too long after. Okay, that's the thing that you would like to do, and because we're talking about a finite time interval, we're fixing a capital T that's finite. Things are different if you're interested in long time statistics. Okay, but for finite time statistics, as delta T goes to 0, you can expect that these spike times, if the time step's small enough, they will start to converge. Okay. But in the fluctuation-driven regime, if one spikes, the current, so in the mean driven it's simple because I by itself is enough to push you up to threshold. And noise actually really only helps because it always pushes the two trajectories in the same direction. If it pushes down, then because of the form of the linear equations, they get contracted, and it pushes up, they just both spike. Okay, so the noise really helps in the mean driven regime. But in the fluctuation driven regime, what can happen is that one spikes and unfortunately, in between the two spikes, maybe you have a downward fluctuation in the forcing, and that has a tendency to push things farther apart. And so whereas the mean-driven regime, noise only helps, and in the fluctuation-driven regime, you're much more sensitive to that. And so statistically, what happens then is then you get much more of the two trajectories diverge much faster. So that's sort of my intuitive explanation for why the two regimes are different. In the paper, we have we think a reasonably complete analysis of the mean-driven regime. Fluctuation-driven regime, we really only have a heuristic argument at this stage. Okay, so that's a little bit more complicated.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. And I also thank all the speakers of this session. We now have a break, and I hope to see you all again in half an hour. Goodbye.
Okay.
So this last thing is about, so the mean driven and fluctuation driven is just that the long-term behavior of the Neuronal is somehow below or above the threshold, right?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So this mean driven and fluctuation driven regime is just the difference between the long-term behavior of the Neuronal is above or below the threshold, right? If
I guess you can look at that way. Yeah.
So then you have a shorter time to cross it, and then you have a phase transition if it becomes below. Yeah.
So in the mean-driven regime, I think one thing that helps to think about this is in the mean-driven regime, the worst case is actually if there's no noise, and because you just have two copies of the same thing, and then they just stay whatever distance apart. And any noise actually help you come together. And fluctuation-driven, when it's fluctuation-driven, it doesn't do that.
So
there's another question. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So
I just want to let you know that you're not on YouTube, but you're still in a meeting, and so you can continue discussing if you want for another bit.
Okay.
There's only one last question I have. So if you are in this balanced network business, so you look at the scaling with respect to n. So you have n neurons, network of n neurons, and then you scale like 1 over the square root of n in the balanced regime. Have you, so there should also some different, let's say, convergence showing up there. So have you tried this out?
Oh.
So the different weights?
No. Yeah, we have not thought about that. Yeah, we have not thought about scaling with network size. That's a very interesting question, but we haven't tried that. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a question on chat. Let me see. How is this generalized if the neurons jump to 0 at a rate which depends on the membrane potential of the neuron? So I guess the question is if so I guess the question is if the neuron can be reset probabilistically depending on its membrane potential. So if I understood the question correctly, I mean the method generalizes in the sense that you just run it with the same run the two copies with the same randomness. But how well it works, I do not know. Yeah, we have not tried that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.